You are listening to the sound of dry grass scraping against leather. It is 3 o'clock in the morning in the high desert of the Wyoming Territory, and the world is so cold that your breath freezes into a brittle mask before it can drift away. You are not romanticizing this moment because your boots have been soaked through since a flash flood crossed the Platte River 3 days ago, and the skin between your toes is beginning to rot. There is no campfire. Fire means light, and light in the territories is an invitation for a Winchester round to find the space between your shoulder blades. Instead, you sit in the absolute dark, shivering next to a horse that is too exhausted to kick, chewing on a strip of salt pork that tastes mostly of dirt and mold. This is the reality of the frontier outlaw. It is not a ballad. It is a slow, freezing war against your own body. The wind coming off the mountains doesn't roar. It whines. It creeps through the gaps in your canvas coat, a cheap garment you stole from a dead rail worker outside of Cheyenne, and reminds you that you haven't slept more than 2 consecutive hours in a fortnight. Every snap of a twig in the brush makes your hand twitch toward the grip of your Colt. Your fingers are too stiff to pull the trigger anyway. You have forgotten what it feels like to be clean, to be warm, or to speak to someone who doesn't look at you with either terror or calculating betrayal. The silence out here is heavy, almost physical, pressing down on your chest until you can hear the frantic, uneven thumping of your own heart. You are a hunted creature. For decades, the printing presses in Chicago and New York have been turning out dime novels about men like you. They write about the freedom of the open range, the thrill of the high-stakes robbery, and the chivalry of the highwayman. They paint pictures of handsome figures with silver spurs and spotless Stetson hats, riding effortlessly into a golden sunset. It is a highly profitable lie sold to factory workers who want to imagine a life less miserable than their own. The truth is much uglier. The truth is an endless cycle of dysentery, toothaches, and the constant, gnawing presence of paranoia. You are not a folk hero. You are an exhausted, dirty fugitive who is likely going to die over $42 and a stolen watch. Think about the weight of that paranoia for a moment. It changes the way a brain functions. When you enter a town, if you even dare to enter one, you do not walk into the saloon with your chest out, looking for a fight. You slip through the alleyways, your eyes darting toward every shadow, trying to determine if the man leaning against the livery stable is a blacksmith or a bounty hunter looking to pay off his mortgage with your corpse. You learn to read the subtle shifts in the air. A sudden silence in a room when you open the door isn't respect. It is the collective intake of breath before the screaming starts. You drink your whiskey with your back to the wall and your left hand free. The glass shakes against your teeth. The vastness of the American West is its own kind of prison. In the movies that will be made a century later, the landscape is beautiful, an epic backdrop of red rock mesas and endless blue skies. But to you, that emptiness is a threat. There is nowhere to hide when the horizon stretches out for 50 miles in every direction. If a posse spots your dust cloud, they don't need to catch you immediately. They just need to follow you until your horse collapses from dehydration. The desert does not care about your reputation. It will bake the water out of your tissues during the afternoon and freeze your sweat into ice at night, indifferent to whether you are a legendary gunslinger or a common horse thief. Let your mind drift to the people you ride with. The dime novels call them a brotherhood of the trail. a band of loyal companions bound by a code of honor. That code is another fiction. Your companions are men just like you, desperate, broken, and deeply untrustworthy. You sleep with one eye open because you know that the reward poster in the sheriff's office grows more valuable every week. The man who shared his tobacco with you yesterday might decide tomorrow that your bounty is worth more than your friendship. There is no loyalty among men who are starving. There is only a mutual agreement not to shoot each other until the immediate danger has passed. The money itself is a cruel joke, even when a robbery goes perfectly. When the express car is blown open and the greenbacks are stuffed into canvas sacks, the wealth is an illusion. You cannot walk into a bank in Denver and deposit $5,000 of stolen Union Pacific payroll. You cannot buy land because land requires a deed, and a deed requires a legal name. Instead, you spend your take in the hell-on-wheels towns, those squalid settlements that spring up along the railroad tracks. There, the saloon keepers and the gamblers know exactly who you are, and they charge you triple for everything. A bottle of watered-down rye that costs $1 for a respectable citizen will cost you 20. They bleed you dry because they know you have nowhere else to go. By the time the sun begins to hint at the eastern horizon, a sickly gray smudge against the black, you are moving again. Your joints click like dried twigs as you heave yourself into the saddle. The leather is stiff and cracked, biting into the sores on your inner thighs. Your horse groans under your weight, its ribs showing prominently through its dull coat. You don't have a destination. You are simply moving away from the place where you spent the night, because staying still is the easiest way to get caught. The light reveals the landscape around you, a bleak expanse of sagebrush and alkali flats, white as salt and just as barren. Your mouth tastes like copper and dust. This is the life you chose. Or perhaps the life that chose you when the bank took your family's farm after the Panic of '73. There was no grand philosophical rebellion. There was just a bad winter, a dead calf, and a line crossed that could never be uncrossed. Now, you are part of the gray history of the West. The history that doesn't make it into the textbooks. It is a history written in shallow graves, forgotten names, and the quiet, agonizing desperation of men who discovered too late that the wild frontier offers no freedom, only an enormous, indifferent loneliness. You are remembering the smell of a damp root cellar in Ohio, or perhaps it was the red clay of a hardscrabble patch in Georgia. Before you were an alias on a federal warrant, you were a child who watched a father stare at a field of rotted corn until the sun went down. There was no grand poetry in your beginning. Your early years were shaped by the relentless, crushing monotony of rural poverty, where a bad frost meant the difference between a winter of dull hunger and a winter of absolute starvation. The house you grew up in was not a home. It was a drafty collection of rough-sawn pine boards that groaned whenever the wind shifted from the north. You learned early that the earth was not a benevolent mother, but a creditor that demanded everything you had and gave back nothing but rocks and sweat. The kitchen was dominated by the sound of a mother coughing into an old rag. It was a wet, rattling sound that filled the small rooms after sundown, a constant reminder of how fragile a human life was when there was no money for a doctor from the county seat. You remember the exact texture of the cornmeal mush you ate for 21 consecutive meals one February, a gray, gelatinous mass that tasted of wood smoke and old iron. There were no books in that house except for a family Bible with a cracked leather spine, its pages stained with the greasy thumbprints of generations of men who had died broken before their 40th birthdays. You looked at your father's hands, calloused, twisted by rheumatism, the fingernails permanently black with soil, and you realized that the law-abiding path led to a single destination. It led to an unmarked plot in the weeds behind the Methodist church. Then came the year the world broke apart. For many men who took to the brush in the 70s and 80s, the pivot point was the war. You were either old enough to carry a heavy musket through the peach orchards of Maryland, or you were a boy who watched the smoke of burning barns rise over the tree line while your mother hid the silver spoons in the well house. That conflict unmoored a generation. It taught young men that human life was the cheapest commodity on the American continent, valued at less than the price of a standard blue or gray wool uniform. When the armies finally disbanded, they turned loose hundreds of thousands of men who knew how to shoot, how to forage, and how to look at a dead body without losing their appetite. They returned to farms that had grown up in briars, only to find a new enemy waiting at the gate: the surveyor and the tax collector. The banks did not use cannon or grape shot, but they were far more efficient than the artillery. They arrived in shiny leather buggies, carrying ledgers bound in calfskin and ink that smelled faintly of vinegar. They spoke a language you did not understand, full of interest rates, quitclaim deeds, and foreclosure notices. Your father stood on the porch with his hat in his hand, looking down at his own boots, while a young clerk with clean fingernails explained that the land no longer belonged to the people who had cleared the oak stumps from it. That was the moment the first crack appeared in your world. You saw that the law was not a shield to protect the honest. It was a club used by the distant and the wealthy to break the stubborn. A quiet, cold rage took root in your chest, growing alongside the hunger. The world was changing around you, even if you couldn't see the full scope of it from your ridge. The telegraph lines were spreading across the desert like a spider's web, carrying your description to towns you had never heard of. Before your horse could even finish its grain, the Pinkertons were opening offices in every major rail hub, filling their files with your measurements, your known associates, and the names of the women you visited when you were lonely. They didn't sleep, they didn't get drunk, and they didn't care about your reputation. They were part of a new machine, an industrial order that had no room for the wild, unpredictable violence of the frontier. You were the anomaly that had to be corrected. You are running out of country. The gray limestone ridges of the Outlaw Trail are no longer a sanctuary. They are a funnel, narrowing with every season as the wire fences of the big cattle syndicates clip the open range into neat, sharp squares. You can feel the change in the air before you see it. The people who used to leave a sack of flour and a jar of lard on the porch of their lined shacks are no longer looking the other way. They have families now. They have schoolhouses with small brass bells, and they have mortgages held by banks in Omaha that do not look kindly on communities that harbor men with prices on their heads. The long, loose tolerance of the frontier is hardening into an industrial peace, and you are the jagged edge that is about to be ground away by the stones. The fracture begins in your feet. Your primary horse, the big, deep-chested dun that could travel 60 miles without a drop of water, steps into a badger hole during a night crossing of the Powder River. You hear the bone snap before the animal can even scream. A wet, splintering sound that makes your stomach turn over. You have to put the muzzle of your revolver against its forehead in the dark, the flash of the black powder blinding you for 3 full minutes, while the echo bounces off the canyon walls like an alarm. After that, you are riding a succession of stolen farm mares and half-broken mules, animals that lack the bottom to outrun a blooded posse. You are always 5 miles slower than you were last year. The gap is closing. The law has changed its face as well. The fat county sheriffs, who used to stop at the county line, have been replaced by the men in the dark suits, the express company, detectives who travel in special rail cars with their own thoroughbred horses and 3 days' rations packed into canvas sacks. They do not carry warrants. They carry maps. They use telescopes with brass barrels that can spot the smoke of a tobacco pipe from 3 miles away. And they move with the methodical, unhurried pace of men who are paid by the month rather than the piece. They do not get angry. They do not seek vengeance. They simply follow your trail with the heavy, mechanical precision of a steam shovel digging a ditch through the clay. You remember the ambush at the crossroads outside of Tascosa. It wasn't a fair fight. There was no challenge, no moment to draw your weapon or make a stand. There was only a sudden, deafening roar from the willow brush as 12-gauge shotguns loaded with buckshot tore into your group from 20 yards away. Your hat was lifted from your head by the wind of a passing slug. The boy riding next to you, the one who used to play the mouth harp around the fire, went over the back of his saddle without a sound, his face already gone before he hit the gravel. You didn't stay to fight. You wheeled your mount, dug your spurs into its flanks until the blood ran down its shoulders, and fled into the brakes like a dog that had been kicked from a kitchen door. The dread becomes a physical taste in your mouth, a sour metallic flavor that reminds you of copper coins. You find that you can no longer swallow solid food. Your throat tightens up whenever you try to chew the salt beef, leaving you to survive on black coffee and whiskey that burns your stomach until you are constantly leaning over your saddle horn to ease the ache. Your skin has turned a yellow, waxen color from the lack of sleep and the constant, cold sweat that breaks out across your ribs whenever a crow calls too loudly from the cottonwoods. You have become an old man at 32, your hair streaking with gray at the temples, and your hands shaking so badly that you have to use both fingers to cock the hammer of your pistol. Let your mind look at the men who are left. The gang has dwindled down to 3 people: yourself, a half-witted kid from the Cherokee Strip who doesn't know his own age, and a silent, bitter man named Miller who spent 4 years in the prison at Jefferson City. There is no conversation between you. You sit around a dry hole at night, staring at each other with eyes that are bloodshot from the alkali dust, each of you wondering how much the others have been offered to bring your ears into the outpost at Buffalo. Miller won't look you in the eye anymore. He spends his time cleaning his fingernails with a long, thin stick, his head tilted toward the trail, as if he is listening for a specific horse to whinny. You know he is going to leave you. You just don't know if he will do it before or after you fall asleep. The world is shrinking down to the size of a single room. You find yourself hiding out in a derelict sod house on the edge of the Badlands, a place where the roof has caved in and the wild mustard grows through the floorboards. The rain is coming down in long, gray needles, turning the dirt walls into a thick, brown grease that smells of old mice and rotten straw. You have 48 rounds of ammunition left in your belt. and $22 in paper currency that has been soaked so many times, the ink has begun to run into blue smears. You are out of tobacco. You are out of salt. You are out of the grand illusions that sustained you when you were 20. When you thought the trail had an end, and the end was a ranch in Argentina. The final fracture isn't a bullet. It is the realization that you have been forgotten while you are still breathing. The dime novels have stopped writing about you. They have moved on to a new crop of boys in Oklahoma or the rail towns of New Mexico, young men whose names are fresher and whose crimes are more spectacular than yours. The newspapers call you a remnant of a bygone era, an obstacle to the statehood of the territory that needs to be cleared away like the timber or the buffalo. You are no longer a threat to the financial centers of the East. You are simply an inconvenience to the local merchants who want to build a creamery and an opera house. The great, wild drama of your life has turned into a nuisance. By the time the winter winds begin to drive the snow through the cracks in the sod walls, you are alone. Miller slipped away during a sleet storm 3 nights ago, taking your spare boots and the best of the remaining blankets with him. You didn't follow him. You didn't even yell after him into the dark. You just sat there on your saddle, your hands tucked into your armpits for warmth, watching the snow accumulate on the threshold like flour spilling from a torn sack. The world has moved past you, leaving you stranded on the sandbar of an old century, waiting for the ice to take you under. You are letting go of the reins. The leather, which once felt like an extension of your own skin, slips from your cold, calloused fingers without a sound. There is no final gunfight in the middle of a sunlit plaza. There is no dramatic monologue delivered to a weeping crowd. There is only the quiet, rhythmic sighing of the winter wind through the dry stalks of the sagebrush, and the slow, steady descent of the snow that covers your tracks as completely as if you had never walked across this earth. The vastness of the territory, which once felt like an enemy trying to starve you, now feels like a heavy wool blanket being pulled up over your chin. It is time to rest. The frontier is closing its eyes, and you are allowed to close yours too. The world you fought so hard to outrun is fading into a soft, monochromatic gray. The banks, the Pinkertons, the telegraph lines, and the rewards, they are all losing their edges, dissolving into the quiet dark like salt in a bucket of rainwater. You think about the names you used to carry, the aliases written in the county court records, and they feel like clothes that belonged to someone else, someone who died a long time ago, in a place you can no longer find on a map. You are no longer the outlaw, the fugitive, or the monster. You are just a man who has grown incredibly tired, sitting in the cold, waiting for the long silence to finally take its turn to speak. Think of the peace that comes with the end of the chase. For 10 years, your mind has been a clock that never stopped ticking, always calculating the distance to the next ridge, the number of cartridges left in the box, and the amount of water in the canteen. Now the clock has run down. You don't have to look over your shoulder anymore. The shadows behind the cottonwoods are just shadows, not men with rifles. The sound of the wind in the chimney isn't the approach of a posse. It is just the air moving across an empty land that has already forgotten your name. The paranoia that filled your chest for a decade is evaporating, leaving behind a clean, empty space that feels almost light. Your first crime was a small thing, so insignificant that you can barely recall the name of the man you wronged. Perhaps it was a calf pulled from a neighbor's herd, during a blinding snowstorm, or a handful of silver dollars taken from the till of a dry goods store while the clerk was in the back fetching a barrel of salt. You remember the adrenaline, though. It was a hot, electric current that washed away the gray fatigue of your daily existence, making your ears ring and your vision sharpen until every grain of wood on the counter stood out in sharp relief. For the first time in your life, you felt powerful. You had taken something from a world that had taken everything from you. It was a fleeting, intoxicating illusion. The transition from a desperate boy to an outlaw happens so slowly you don't even notice the borders as you cross them. You tell yourself that you will just do this one thing, just get enough to buy a decent pair of boots and a train ticket west, and then you will settle down. But the territory doesn't work that way. Every step you take away from the town square makes the return journey twice as long. One morning, you wake up in a boarding house in Missouri, and you look out the window to see two men in long linen dusters watching the entrance. You don't ask if they have a warrant. You slide out the back window into the mud of the stable yard, abandon your trunk, and ride out on a horse you haven't paid for. Just like that, the gate shuts behind you. You learn the language of the borderlands. It is a dialect spoken in glances, nods, and long silences over greasy plates in sod houses. You learn to recognize the properties where the owner will sell you a fresh mount for double its value and keep his mouth shut when the marshal rides through 3 hours later. These are not your friends. They are parasites who feed on your danger, skimming off the profit of your crimes, while risk remains entirely yours. They look at you with a mixture of pity and calculating greed, wondering if this is the week your luck runs out. They know that if they turn you in, the neighbors will burn their haystacks. But if they shelter you too long, the law will take their land. Everyone is weighing the cost of your existence. By your 25th year, your face has changed. The softness of the farm boy has been burned away by the alkaline wind, and the constant, sour taste of bad whiskey and cheap tobacco. Your teeth are beginning to loosen at the gums from a lack of fresh greens, and you have a scar across your left knuckles from a knife fight in a tent saloon outside of Wichita. A dispute over a card game you can't even remember. You have become a professional survivor. Your world has shrunk down to the length of your rifle barrel and the stamina of your horse. The past is a useless weight, a collection of ghosts that only serve to make your hand hesitate when it needs to be steady. You do not think of your mother's kitchen anymore. The shadows of your origin follow you nonetheless, not as memories, but as a physical ache in your lower back whenever the rain sets in. You are the product of an empire expanding too fast for its own skin, leaving behind a wake of ruined families and broken men who have no place in the new order of smokestacks and stock tickers. You are the human refuse of the frontier, the raw material that the newspapers use to terrify the citizens of Boston and Philadelphia. They think you are a monster who chose the darkness because you loved the blood. They do not know about the root cellar or the corn that rotted in the dirt while an old man wept into his calloused hands. You are standing in the middle of a dirt street in a town whose name you will forget before the winter is over. The air smells of horse dung, hot dust, and the sharp, chemical tang of cheap zinc from the new roofs. Around you, the world is moving at a frantic, terrifying pace, fueled by eastern gold and the iron tracks that are cutting across the prairie. like surgical incisions. You are no longer the frightened boy who fled the farm in the dead of night. You have acquired a reputation, a name that men whisper when the barkeep isn't looking, and for the first time in your life, you possess power. It is a strange, brittle kind of authority, built entirely on the knowledge that you are willing to kill a man before he can clear his holster. You have entered the pinnacle of your career, the brief, brilliant moment before the momentum shifts and the world begins to hunt you in earnest. The money comes fast now, so fast that it loses its meaning. You remember the first real haul? The express car outside of Green River, where the iron safe yielded to 3 sticks of black powder with a sound that felt like it shattered the sky itself. The greenbacks didn't look like real currency. They were crisp, clean packages of federal notes that smelled of fresh ink and paper mills. You stuffed them into your shirt, into your saddlebags, until your horse groaned under the weight of wealth you could never openly spend. That night, you sat in a hidden canyon and counted $24,000 by the light of a single tallow candle. It was more money than your father had seen in his entire lifetime of labor, and yet you couldn't use it to buy a decent meal. This is the great irony of the outlaw's zenith. Your wealth increases exactly as your world contracts. You can afford the finest silk shirts from the catalogs, but you must wear them beneath a greasy wool vest so you don't draw attention on the trail. You buy a beautiful, pearl-handled Colt with intricate engraving along the cylinder, but its only purpose is to sit in a holster that is tied down to your thigh with a greasy leather thong. You have become a king of the Badlands, but your kingdom consists of hidden draws, alkaline springs that taste like copper, and the high, windswept ridges where the wind never stops blowing. You are rich, but you are still sleeping on a wet blanket with your boots on. Let your mind rest on the nature of the crew you have assembled. They call you the leader, but leadership in this world is a daily negotiation with violence. There are no corporate hierarchies here. There is only the constant, subtle assessment of who is still loyal and who is beginning to look at the reward posters with a lingering curiosity. You watch them around the campfires. Men like Shorty Gallagher, whose eyes are always wet from some old lung sickness, or the Texan who doesn't speak for 3 days at a time, but carries a Bowie knife that he sharpens until the edge is invisible. They look to you because your luck hasn't run out yet. The moment your foot slips, the moment you hesitate during a holdup, or show a flash of sympathy for a line rider, that leadership will vanish like smoke. They don't love you. They are simply riding your streak. The betrayals are never loud. They don't happen with a dramatic confrontation in the middle of the street. They happen in the dark, with a whispered conversation between a minor gang member and a deputy sheriff in the back of a livery stable. You begin to notice the small changes. A companion who used to ride at your shoulder now lags 50 yards behind, watching the tree line. Another man is suddenly very particular about how his horse is tethered at night, ensuring his mount is facing the open trail while yours is blocked by the brush. You learn to sleep with your hand wrapped around the cylinder of your revolver, your thumb resting on the hammer. Every noise, the hoot of a burrowing owl, the click of a pebble under a deer's hoof, becomes a question that must be answered with a drawn weapon. The pinnacle is a lonely place because you realize that the myth has overtaken the reality. In the newspapers back east, they are writing columns about your daring exploits. describing you as a modern-day Robin Hood who robs from the railroad monopolies and gives to the poor homesteaders. It is a useful fiction that keeps the local farmers from turning you in. But you know the truth. You don't give the money away. You spend it on $40 bottles of champagne in the hidden brothels of Fort Worth. Or you lose it in 3 hours at a faro table to a dealer who uses a shaved deck. You are not a social reformer. You are a highly efficient engine for transferring wealth from the corporations to the gamblers. And the cost of that transfer is your own sanity. You remember the high point, the moment you felt entirely invincible. It was a crisp October morning when you held up the Denver and Rio Grande train near the border. The passengers didn't fight back. They sat in their velvet seats, with their hands raised, their faces pale and slick with sweat, looking at you as if you were an apparition from the underworld. You walked down the aisle with a canvas sack, listening to the golden watches and diamond rings drop into the cloth with a heavy, satisfying clink. A young woman in a fine wool dress looked up at you, her eyes wide with terror, and whispered, "Please, mister, don't shoot." You didn't shoot. You smiled, tipped your hat, and felt like a god for exactly 3 minutes. Then the engineer blew the whistle, and the panic returned. That afternoon, you rode 40 miles through a blinding dust storm that turned the sun into a bloody orange eye. The gold in your bags clinked against your stirrups, a constant, heavy reminder of what you had done. By nightfall, the adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a cold, gray exhaustion that settled into your bones like winter grease. You sat in a cave that smelled of mountain lion urine, shivering despite the heat of the fire, watching your companions argue over the distribution of the rings. You looked at the wealth spread out on an old blanket and realized that you had reached the very top of the mountain. There was nowhere left to go but down,